Israel. So that's actually a very complicated question, because Jerusalem, there's no one there. They're in exile. Whereas the people of Israel, they're in exile. So is it to them? And these are not written to the dead, it's written to the survivors, who then took it and continued to pass it on. Now, one of the really challenging things, if you come to read Isaiah and all these poems, despite the fact that I said that this is a story, this is not a narrative that's easy to read in a flowing sense. You have oracles thrown together, almost like someone picked them up and threw them on the wall, and they all just seem to be pieced together. You can find a little bit of a story going through it. If you just read word to go from Isaiah 40 to 55, it's a difficult read. It's like it goes from here and then over here and then over here. And that comes to one of the features of trauma literature that I want us to have a look at. We've already kind of mentioned some of the images.
Is that not the story of trauma? As it goes from here, it goes from there, it goes to here, and it's fractured and it's not a cohesive narrative.
Exactly. So think about then, if trauma studies is only new to biblical studies in the last 30 years, that's a new revelation. Seems obvious, doesn't it? But actually that wasn't understood. It was like, oh, well, this must be an editing problem.
So written in trauma.
Yeah. Yeah.
The writing of trauma.
Yep.
In trauma.
Yep.
So the writing style's a metaphor in itself.
Yeah. So there's another really interesting case with Lamentations, for example. Lamentations is a text all about the destruction of Jerusalem. It's a lament, a funeral dirge over the death of a city. And the way it is written is very structured acrostic poem in Hebrew. And the people would have been used to, that's a structural form of lament that we have as a culture, getting up and we use this and we know, we expect, it gives us words. But that particular acrostic is broken, it's incomplete. And so some scholars suggest, even within the text itself, we see the fracture. Even in the structure and the style, the lack of completion, that's trauma, even there. And those kind of findings really came out of Holocaust theology again. So what we're really getting to is this literary approach. So I've talked about some of the, I guess, composition questions and so on, the historical background we might look at, and that could be helpful if we were studying this passage to know a little bit more about this historical background. I've kind of given you a little bit as we've gone through. But now to look specifically at this literary approach, it's, at the end of the day, it's looking at the text and taking the text for what it is. And there are a number of ways. So, Chris, you've already talked about the reader response approach, to sit and to dwell on the reception of the text for you today, in the context that you're in today. Rhetorical criticism looks far more at the structure, a little bit as I've just gotten you to do. Not just how you receive it today, but how's it actually structured? How does that affect the way that you read? And then you look far more at the words and the structure within it, the use of characters in a story or reactions or events. And then looking at literary devices such as personification and metaphor and simile, which are often used in these texts. So in your handout, I've listed a few kind of literary features that are common to trauma texts. And you might actually want to have a look at those and then compare it to what you're seeing in that passage in Isaiah. And I'm saying this passage in Isaiah, I don't think I've seen anyone write on this other than I've written something on it. But no, like for me, even when I was researching it, no one's writing on it as though it's a trauma text. So what you've picked up today, that actually can seem quite obvious. People think it's a text of hope, and yet if you look through this list, you can see that there's a lot of these features.
And if you are in the midst of trauma, vengeance is a very different beast than if you're not. And vengeance can be the only emotion that's available to you that isn't pain. It
gives you a little bit of strength in a sense.
To me, it's still not hope, but it's that that powerlessness that you have in trauma. Maybe I can do something. If only I could kill that person, it would stop. that kind of
being able to say the
response.
unspeakable almost.
That kind of response, and yet, if you read it in the present day, and you take it as, and I'm going back to my very early experience of Catholicism,
Mm.
if you read this as actual, and that therefore vengeance is the correct response,
Mm.
it's a very different beast.
It can become a dangerous text
It's
and be
a-
used to re-traumatise and to
Yes.
cause trauma to others in following generations.
And to mess with people's values.
Yeah, yep, absolutely. That's definitely a risk. So some of the literary features of trauma texts. So this kind of study with trauma and literature has been around for a long time, as I said, probably since the time of post-Holocaust studies of writing coming out of the Holocaust. And Freud has been used a lot with looking at literature and text. So Kathy Carruth, who is a very well-known writer on trauma and texts, has said if Freud turned to literature to describe traumatic experience, it is because literature, like psychoanalysis, is interested in the complex relation between knowing and not knowing. And it is indeed a specific point at which knowing and not knowing intersect that the language of literature and psychoanalytic theory of traumatic experience precisely meet. They're trying to put language around traumatic experiences that are actually very difficult to describe and by their nature sometimes impossible. So one of the things, as I've said before, that emerged out of Holocaust theology and Holocaust writing was the understanding that people did not necessarily give objective accounts of those experiences. In fact, that could take generations. And in one of the readings by David Garber, he suggests that survivor literature includes heightened fissures in language, puns, wordplay, and multiple levels of meaning. And that can make them very difficult to read today and understand. If the text itself is fractured or the metaphors are very obscure, the puns go over our head, then sometimes we don't even realise we're reading those kind of things because it's literature of trauma. He goes on to explain that the complexities of putting trauma into words never seem enough to describe the inner pain, let alone figure it all out. And the need to testify to the trauma, so the need to be able to say, this is what happened to me, or this is what happened to us. That competes with the desire to run away from the trauma and never speak of it again. And we hear a lot about that from traumatised communities who don't want to sit and have that therapy session that I showed you at the beginning. The last thing I want to do is sit and talk about what traumatised me, because then I'm reliving it. Or I might not even have the framework to even understand, because all my framework of reality and the way I saw the world has been absolutely shattered. So how do I even begin to explain it? So within trauma literature then, what we're looking for are these kind of wordplays and puns, multiple meanings, ambiguity, mimicry and mockery. The gaps in the text. So one of the big things that used to be said about the exile in Old Testament studies is, if it was such a big event, why don't we read it more? So this text here of Isaiah 40 to 55, a text that is supposedly written in the time of exile, barely mentions exile. Except even in the passage you've read, you get allusions to it, you get metaphors, it kind of fluffs around it. It doesn't say, well, on this day the Babylonians rode on in. It's like what they call this massive lacuna in the text. And so rather than seeing that as, well, that's not what it's talking about, maybe that's precisely what it's talking about. The very thing that it's trying to allude to or ignore is the very thing that's caused that text to emerge. The hidden transcripts idea, this is the idea that there are layers, accounts of trauma layered in the text, sometimes for subversive reasons, particularly when written in a position of subjugation. So it might be texts of protests. The other side effect of trauma is the effect it has on memory. And that memory is not necessarily linear, it's not necessarily clear, and it's hard to piece together all of those things. So do we see that occurring in the text? Do we see things being reframed? So things that seem to be presented this way in the past being presented differently. Flashbacks and so on. So what we're looking for when we're looking at biblical text is all of that list of those events that I talked to you about before, right at the beginning in the Old and New Testament. Do we see depictions of those events? Do we see depictions of war, exile, power, death, imprisonment, captivity, abuse, rape, threats, loss, social, economic and political breakdown? Are they obvious or are they not? So most of this would suggest to us that they're often not obvious. In fact, if you look at the book of Kings, build up to exile, and then the exile happens. And all the people were exiled. It's like this massive event, and then that's all it says. And then they came back. It's like, what? Where's the documentary evidence? And we're also looking for some indirect language around shame, humiliation, self-loathing, despair, loss, violence, hostility, blame, learned helplessness. So complete reliance on someone else leading or doing, the inability to socialise, disassociation, separation from that event or splitting, boredom. When you think about those things, when we look in the next session at Ezekiel. Then language around reframing, resilience, building, reformation of identity. Is that what we're seeing with these hope sides in Isaiah 51, a reframing of an identity? And coping strategies. Then survivor guilt. So the notion, if I survived this traumatic event that a lot of people didn't, then I must need to do something with my life. And so on. Any thoughts or reflections on those literary features before we have a 5-minute break?
It seems ironic, but this stuff that's so, in many cases, so physical and visceral. We call these stories sacred. And maybe it only seems ironic because we've done this dualistic split thing between what's real and what's holy.
Yes.
But it seems to me that if we get rid of that dualistic split, we can see the sacredness of the text is actually its capacity to reveal meaning in all this stuff, what this means.
Rather than perfection,
right?
And having it all together. And
the raw humanity of this stuff is extraordinary.
Yeah. How about we take a 5-minute break, and in the last 20 minutes, I'm going to get you to do we'll probably break up into 2 major groups, and we'll look at 2 different approaches to using texts of trauma in pastoral and spiritual care contexts.